The sun had barely climbed over the manicured hedges of the estate, but she was already moving. Her day started in the quiet, cold kitchen, the smell of lemon soap and old stone filling the air. Her name was Ilara, and in this big house full of beautiful things, she was part of the furniture, something to be used and not really seen. She wore the simple, gray uniform that marked her as one of the staff, a costume that made her invisible to the people who lived there. Her hands, though rough from scrubbing floors and polishing silver, held a gentleness that no one ever noticed. She moved from room to room with a quiet grace, her footsteps soft on the thick carpets that cost more than her family would see in a year. She would dust the delicate porcelain figures, wipe the smudges from grand paintings, and make sure every surface reflected the light just so. It was a world of immense wealth, a world that felt a million miles away from her own small, rented room on the other side of town. But there was one thing in this house that didn't feel like a million miles away. It felt like home. It was the piano. It sat in the middle of the grand ballroom, a huge black Bissendorfer that seemed to breathe with a life of its own. Its polished surface reflected the crystal chandeliers like a dark, still lake. During the day she would clean around it, her fingers lingering just a moment too long on the smooth, cool wood. She would imagine the vibrations of the music that had been played on it, the echoes of laughter and applause that had filled the room. But for her it was silent, a beautiful silent giant. Her love for the piano wasn't born in a place like this. It was born in a small, cramped apartment, with the smell of her mother's cooking and the sound of an old, rickety upright piano that had seen better days. Her mother had been a piano teacher, a woman with kind eyes and hands that could coax the most beautiful music out of even the most tired strings. Ilara remembered sitting on the bench next to her, her small fingers trying to copy her mother's. "Don't just play the notes, my love," her mother would say, her voice soft and warm. "Play the story behind them. Feel the music in your heart before you let it out through your fingers." Her mother was gone now, but her lessons were etched into Ilara's soul. The piano was her last connection to her, a way to keep her memory alive. So, every night, after the big house fell silent and the only sounds were the creak of the old building settling, Ilara would sneak into the ballroom. Her heart would pound in her chest, a mix of fear and excitement. She would close the heavy doors gently, leaving just a sliver of light from the hallway to guide her. Then she would sit on the cool leather bench, her hands hovering over the ivory keys for just a second before she let them dance. In the darkness of the ballroom, she was not the invisible maid. She was a musician. Her fingers, tired from a day of hard work, would come alive on the keys. She would play the old songs her mother taught her, the complex classical pieces she had practiced for hours and the simple melodies she made up herself. The music would fill the empty room, a wave of sound that was full of all the things she couldn't say during the day. It was full of her sadness, her hopes, her loneliness, and her dreams. It was her secret, her one true freedom. The house was currently buzzing with a different kind of energy. A famous pianist was coming to stay. His name was Julian Croft, and he was a big deal. He was going to perform at a charity recital being hosted by the owners of the estate. The staff was all running around, getting everything perfect for his arrival. Ilara heard the whispers while she was working. "He's a genius," one of the other maids said, her eyes wide. "They say he can play anything perfectly." "He's very handsome, too," another one giggled. Ilara just kept her head down and continued her work. She had heard of Julian Croft. She had seen his posters in music stores and read about him in magazines. They called him a virtuoso, a master of the piano. A few days after he arrived, she heard him play for the first time. She was in the library, dusting the bookshelves, when the sound drifted in from the ballroom. It was a piece by Chopin, one of her favorites. She stopped what she was doing and listened. His technique was incredible. Every note was perfect, every run was flawless, every dynamic was precise. It was like listening to a recording. But as she listened, she felt nothing. It was beautiful, yes, but it was empty. It was like looking at a perfect diamond. It was brilliant and shiny, but it had no warmth, no life. He was playing all the right notes, but he was missing the music. He was playing the technicalities, but not the story. Her mother's words came back to her. Play the story behind them. Feel the music in your heart. She was sure that Julian Croft felt nothing in his heart when he played. He was just a machine, a perfect, polished, soulless machine. And for some reason that made her a little sad and a little angry. Here she was, with a heart full of music that she could only share with the empty walls of a ballroom, and he was out there, being called a genius, playing with no soul at all. It just didn't seem fair. She shook her head and went back to her dusting, the sound of his perfect, empty music following her around the house like a ghost. The night of the big recital felt different. The air in the house was thick with a strange energy, a mix of excitement and tension that made the skin on Ilara's arms prickle. The grand ballroom, where she usually found her quiet solitude, was now a world of blinding light and hushed voices. The crystal chandeliers were all lit, throwing rainbows of light across the polished floors. Important people from all over the city were starting to arrive, dressed in their finest clothes. The men looked sharp in their dark suits, and the women were like colorful flowers in their expensive gowns. Ilara moved through them with a tray of glasses, her gray uniform a dull shadow among all the silk and satin. She was invisible, just as she was supposed to be, but tonight it felt even more pronounced. She was a ghost at a party for the living. She could hear the buzz of conversation, the soft clinking of ice in glasses, and the low, elegant music coming from a small string quartet in the corner. All of it was for the main event, the performance by the famous Julian Croft. Ilara felt a familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach. She had spent the day avoiding the ballroom, not wanting to see him or hear his perfect, empty music. She just wanted the night to be over so she could go back to her secret, silent world. But as she was heading back to the kitchen, she heard a noise from the hallway leading to the backstage area. It wasn't the sound of music. It was the sound of shouting. She hesitated, her curiosity getting the better of her. She ducked behind a large potted fern and listened. The voices were muffled, but she could make out the angry, booming voice of Mr. Sterling, the owner of the house. This is unacceptable. Do you have any idea what you have done? We have 200 of the city's most influential people out there. Another voice answered, cool and dripping with arrogance. It was Julian Croft. Your refusal to meet my fee is what's unacceptable, Sterling. The stress has brought on a migraine. A severe one. I cannot possibly perform. My art cannot be created under such conditions. Ilara could hear the frustration in Mr. Sterling's voice. Your fee. We agreed on a sum, and you demanded more at the last minute. This is blackmail. It is business, Croft shot back. And now it is over. I am returning to my room. Send my car in the morning. She heard a door slam shut, and then a sound of pure despair like someone groaning. Peeking through the leaves of the fern, she saw Mr. Sterling run his hands through his perfectly styled hair, messing it up completely. His wife, Mrs. Sterling, stood there, her face pale with shock. The event coordinator, a woman with a tight bun and an even tighter expression, was fluttering around them like a panicked bird. What do we do? What do we tell them? She whispered, her voice trembling. We can't cancel. Think of the charity. Think of the humiliation. The next few minutes were a blur of controlled chaos. Staff members were running back and forth. Someone suggested playing a recording of Julian Croft's music, but Mrs. Sterling shot that down immediately. They paid to see a performance, not to listen to a CD in a ballroom. She hissed. Another person suggested having the string quartet play for longer, but it was clear they were not the main attraction. The guests were getting restless. The low hum of conversation was getting louder, punctuated by occasional glances towards the empty stage. Ilara watched from her hiding spot, her heart pounding. She felt a strange sense of detachment, like she was watching a play. This was a world of problems she couldn't even imagine. A ruined party was a disaster for these people. For her, a disaster was not having enough money for rent. Then she saw Mrs. Sterling's eyes land on a young footman who was standing nearby, looking terrified. You, she said, her voice sharp. Have you seen anything? Heard anything unusual? The boy, who couldn't have been more than 16, swallowed hard. Unusual, ma'am? Yes, anything. Someone who might be able to help. The footman looked at the floor, shuffling his feet. Well, ma'am, it's probably nothing. Spit it out? Mr. Sterling barked. The boy flinched. Sometimes late at night, I hear music from the ballroom. Piano music. Mrs. Sterling stared at him. Piano music? That's impossible. The ballroom is locked. I know, ma'am, but I hear it. It's beautiful, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Ilara's blood ran cold. Her secret. Her one private thing. It was out? She saw a flicker of something in Mrs. Sterling's eyes. It was a wild, desperate, crazy idea. She grabbed the footman by the arm. Who is playing? I don't know for sure, ma'am. I've never seen anyone, but one time I thought I saw the maid. His eyes darted towards the kitchen. The quiet one, Ilara. The world seemed to stop for Ilara. She felt like she couldn't breathe. They knew they were going to fire her. She was going to be thrown out for touching their precious piano. She started to back away, trying to melt into the shadows. But it was too late. Mrs. Sterling had already turned, her eyes scanning the hallway. They locked onto Ilara, who was still half hidden behind the fern. You, Mrs. Sterling said, her voice a strange mix of disbelief and urgency. She started walking towards her steps quick and determined. Ilara wanted to run, but her feet were frozen to the floor. Is it true? Mrs. Sterling demanded when she reached her. Have you been playing our piano? Ilara could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. She felt tears of fear prick at her eyes. I'm so sorry, she finally managed to choke out. I didn't mean any harm. I'll never do it again, please. But Mrs. Sterling wasn't listening to her apology. She was looking her up and down, her eyes intense. Can you play? Really play? Yes, ma'am. My mother taught me. Mrs. Sterling grabbed her by the arm, her grip surprisingly strong. You have to do it. Ilara stared at her, confused. Do what? You have to go out there. You have to play the piano. The words hit Ilara like a physical blow. No, she whispered, shaking her head. I can't. I'm not. I'm just a maid. You are the only hope we have, Mrs. Sterling said, her voice low and fierce. You will go out there and you will play, or you will be dismissed on the spot for trespassing and theft. Do you understand me? It wasn't a choice. It was a threat. It was an impossible, terrifying choice. Play in front of all those people in her scratchy maid's uniform and be mocked and humiliated. Or lose her job, her home, and the only connection she had left to her mother. She looked at Mrs. Sterling's desperate face, at the chaos swirling around her, and knew there was no way out. The program, Mrs. Sterling said, shoving a piece of paper into her hands. It's all chopping. You know it? Ilara looked down at the paper. The titles of the songs swam before her eyes. They were some of the hardest pieces, but she knew them. She had played them in the dark for no one but herself. She nodded again, feeling numb. Good, Mrs. Sterling said. She straightened Ilara's collar, a strange, motherly gesture that felt completely out of place. Go on. They're waiting. And with a gentle but firm push, she sent Ilara stumbling towards the stage, towards the blinding lights and the sea of expectant faces. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, and her hands were shaking so much she thought she might drop the music. She was no longer a ghost. She was being pushed into the light, and she had never been more terrified in her entire life. The push from Mrs. Sterling was not hard, but it sent Ilara stumbling forward into a world of blinding light. It felt like walking into the sun. For a moment she couldn't see anything at all, just a wall of white that made her eyes water. The low hum of 200 people talking suddenly felt very loud, very close. It was a living sound, a wave of noise that washed over her, and she was drowning in it. Her feet, clad in simple, sensible shoes, found the smooth, polished wood of the stage. Each step felt heavy, like she was walking through mud. She could feel the eyes of the entire room on her, a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. Her heart was not just beating. It was a frantic drum against her ribs, a wild animal trying to break free. She thought about turning back, about running into the darkness of the wings, but she knew there was no escape. Mrs. Sterling's threat echoed in her ears. You will be dismissed on the spot. Losing this job was not an option. It was her lifeline. As her eyes slowly adjusted to the light, the scene in front of her came into focus. It was a sea of faces, all turned towards her. They were a blur of colors and shapes at first, but then they started to become individual people. She saw a woman in a sparkling blue dress, a diamond necklace glittering at her throat. She saw a man with a perfectly groomed white mustache, looking at her over the top of his glasses. She saw rows and rows of people, all dressed in their best, their faces filled with a look she knew all too well. It was the look they gave her when she was polishing their silver or serving their food. It was a look that said she was not important. She was part of the background. But tonight, she was not in the background. She was on the stage. The whispers started. It was a soft rustle at first, like leaves in the wind, but it grew louder, more distinct. Is this part of the show? A woman's voice, sharp and clear, cut through the noise. Some kind of avant-garde performance piece? Another voice, a man's, answered with a laugh. It looks like they've brought the help out to tune the piano. A ripple of laughter followed, a cruel, easy sound that made Alara's cheeks burn with shame. She wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. She felt small and exposed in her simple gray uniform. It was a scratchy, ill-fitting thing that felt like a costume for a role she was never meant to play. Here she was, a girl from the wrong side of town, standing on a stage meant for stars in front of people who had never had to worry about anything more serious than what wine to serve with dinner. She finally reached the center of the stage, where the grand piano sat waiting for her. It looked even bigger and more intimidating up here under the bright lights. It was a beautiful monster, and she was supposed to tame it. Her hands were shaking so badly that she had to clench them into fists at her sides to stop them. She could feel a cold sweat on her forehead, and her throat was so dry it felt like it was full of sand. She looked out at the crowd again, and her eyes met the gaze of a man in the front row. He was looking at her not with curiosity, but with a kind of bored disdain. He raised an eyebrow as if to say, "Well, get on with it." That look, more than anything, broke through her fear. It sparked a tiny flicker of something else deep inside her. It wasn't courage. Not yet. It was more like defiance. A quiet, stubborn refusal to be completely broken by their judgment. She thought about her mother. She could almost see her, sitting on their old couch in their small apartment, a gentle smile on her face. "Don't just play the notes, my love." Her mother's voice seemed to say inside her head, a memory so clear it was like she was right there. "Play the story behind them. Feel the music in your heart before you let it out through your fingers." This was her story. It was a story of being unseen, of being underestimated, of having a fire inside her that no one ever saw. These people saw a maid. They didn't see the hours she had spent practicing. The calluses on her fingers hidden by her work gloves. The tears she had shed over difficult passages. The pure joy she felt when a piece of music finally came together. They saw a uniform, not a person. Slowly, carefully, she lowered herself onto the piano bench. It was a long, polished bench, and she felt very small sitting on it. She placed the program Mrs. Sterling had given her on the music stand. The notes on the page looked like little black ants, scurrying around in a panic. She took a deep, shaky breath, trying to calm the storm raging inside her. The air in the ballroom was thick with expectation, but it wasn't the kind of expectation she had dreamed of. It was the expectation of a spectacle, of a failure. They were waiting for her to mess up, to prove them right, to give them something to gossip about at their next dinner party. She lifted her hands and placed them on the keys. The ivory was cool and smooth under her trembling fingers. It felt familiar. It felt like home. In this moment, with her hands on the piano, the rest of the world seemed to fade away just a little. The bright lights were not so harsh. The faces in the crowd were not so clear. It was just her and the piano. This was the one place where she was not just a maid. This was the one place where she could speak without saying a word. She closed her eyes for a second, blocking out the world, and just listened to the silence. It was a heavy, waiting silence. She could feel the weight of 200 pairs of eyes on her back. She thought of her mother again, of her kind eyes and her unwavering belief. She was not just doing this for the Sterlings. She was not just doing this to keep her job. She was doing this for her. She was doing this for the memory of the woman who had taught her that music was more than just notes. It was the language of the soul. With another deep breath, she began to play. The first notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 filled the air. They were hesitant, a little unsure, a reflection of the fear that was still gripping her. But they were clear. The sound of the piano was so rich, so full, that it seemed to push against the walls of the grand ballroom. The whispers in the crowd died down, replaced by a surprised, attentive silence. They had been expecting a clumsy, amateurish performance. They had been expecting a joke. But the sound coming from the piano was not a joke. It was music. And as the first few moments of the piece passed, something began to change. Ilara's fingers, which had been shaking just moments before, started to remember what to do. They started to move with more confidence, more purpose. She was no longer just thinking about the notes on the page. She was starting to feel the music, to let it flow through her. The story was beginning to unfold. The first few notes hung in the air, fragile and alone, like a single bird in a vast empty sky. Ilara's fingers, which had felt stiff and foreign just moments before, began to remember the feel of the keys. The hesitant melody of the ballade started to unfold, a soft, questioning voice in the heavy silence of the ballroom. Her mind was still racing, a whirlwind of fear and doubt. She could feel the scratch of her uniform on her neck, the tightness of her simple shoes on her feet. She was still the maid, on a stage where she didn't belong. But as her fingers continued to move, something began to shift. The music was a familiar friend, a voice she had known her entire life. It started to pull her away from the blinding lights and the sea of faces. It pulled her into a world where only she and the piano existed. The gentle opening melody began to grow, gaining a quiet confidence. It was like the first light of dawn, slowly pushing away the darkness. Ilara's back, which had been rigid with tension, started to relax. Her shoulders softened. Her breathing, which had been short and sharp, began to deepen, matching the rhythm of the music. She was no longer just pressing keys. She was telling a story. The story was her own. The soft, melancholic notes were the loneliness she felt, the long hours spent cleaning a house that never felt like a home. They were the memory of her mother's gentle smile, the warmth of her hand on her shoulder, the ache of her absence. She played for the little girl who sat on a rickety piano bench, trying to make her fingers match the beauty she heard in her head. The music began to change. The soft melody was interrupted by a series of more agitated, questioning chords. It was the sound of her own doubts, the voice that told her she wasn't good enough, that she would always be just a maid. Her fingers moved faster, the notes becoming more insistent. In the crowd, a man who had been whispering to his wife fell silent. He turned his head fully towards the stage, his expression of bored curiosity slowly melting away, replaced by a look of deep concentration. The woman in the sparkling blue dress, who had been fanning herself lazily, lowered her fan. Her hand went to her chest, as if feeling a sudden, unexpected flutter. The mocking whispers had died completely, replaced by a silence that was different now. It was no longer a silence of judgment. It was a silence of attention. Ilara was lost to the world now. Her eyes were closed, her face a mask of pure emotion. She wasn't thinking about the notes or the technique. Her hands were moving on their own, guided by years of practice and a heart overflowing with unspoken words. The music swelled into a passionate, stormy section. The notes were no longer soft raindrops. They were a torrential downpour, a river of sound that swept through the ballroom, washing away everything in its path. It was her anger, her frustration at a world that saw her as invisible. It was the fury she felt at the arrogant pianist who played with no soul. the injustice of a life where her talent was a secret to be ashamed of. Her body began to move with the music, swaying slightly as her hands flew across the keys. The uniform, the stage, the crowd, it all faded away. There was only the music, a raw, honest, and incredibly beautiful cry from the depths of her soul, a young couple, who had been more interested in each other than the stage, now stood frozen, their eyes locked on the girl at the piano. They saw the tears that were now streaming down Ilara's face, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of release, of pure, unfiltered emotion. She was giving them everything she had, holding nothing back. It was the most vulnerable, most powerful performance they had ever witnessed. The old man with the white mustache slowly took off his glasses, polishing them with a handkerchief, but it was just an excuse to wipe the moisture from his own eyes. He had heard all the great pianists of his time, but he had never heard anything like this. This wasn't just music. It was a confession. The storm of passion began to subside, giving way to a section of the piece that was filled with a sense of longing and hope. The notes were softer now, but they carried a new weight, a new meaning. They were no longer just sad. They were resilient. It was the feeling of getting up after you've been knocked down, of finding the strength to face another day. It was the memory of her mother's voice telling her to never give up, to always let the music in her heart be her guide. Ilara's playing became more delicate, more nuanced. Every note was filled with a delicate beauty that was heartbreaking. She was not just playing the piano. She was healing herself with the music, and in doing so, she was touching the hearts of everyone in the room. They were no longer seeing a maid in a uniform. They were seeing an artist. They were seeing a soul. The final section of the ballade began to build. It was a return to the storm, but this time it was different. It was not just angry. It was triumphant. The notes were powerful, cascading down the keyboard in a dazzling display of skill and emotion. It was the sound of a spirit that could not be broken. Ilara's whole body was now part of the music. Her head was tilted back, her face lifted towards the light as if in a prayer. Her hands were a blur of motion, a dance of pure energy and grace. The entire ballroom was held captive, suspended in the power of the moment. The air crackled with an energy so thick you could almost feel it. No one moved. No one breathed. They were all completely and utterly mesmerized. Then came the final, thunderous chords. They were not just loud. They were a declaration. A statement of truth? They echoed through the silent hall, a final, powerful release of all the emotion that had been building throughout the piece. Ilara's hands came down on the keys with a force that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. And then, as the final, powerful note began to fade, she lifted her hands from the keyboard, holding them in the air for a moment. As if still feeling the vibration of the music, the sound didn't just stop. It seemed to be absorbed by the walls, the ceiling, the very hearts of the people listening. A profound, breathless silence fell over the ballroom. It was a heavy, sacred silence, full of the ghosts of the notes that had just been played. It was the sound of 200 people who had been taken on a journey and had not yet found their way back. Ilara sat at the piano, her chest heaving, her body trembling with exhaustion and emotion. Her head was bowed, her hair falling over her face. She was still lost in her world, unaware of the stunned, reverent silence she had created. She had silenced them, just as the title promised. But it was not a silence of defeat. It was a silence of awe. The silence that followed the last, fading note was the heaviest thing Ilara had ever felt. It wasn't an empty silence. It was full, packed so tightly with emotion that it felt like a physical presence in the room. It pressed down on her, on the stage, on the very air she was trying to breathe. Her head was still bowed, her hair clinging to the damp skin of her forehead. Her hands rested limply in her lap, the fingers trembling uncontrollably. She was exhausted, emptied out as if she had poured every single drop of herself into the piano. For a long moment she stayed like that, lost in the echoes of the music, unaware of anything outside of her own little world of sound and feeling. She didn't see the 200 pairs of eyes fixed on her. She didn't see the tears on the cheeks of the woman in the sparkling blue dress or the look of utter disbelief on the face of the man with the white mustache. Then, a single sound broke the spell. It was the sharp, distinct clap of a pair of hands coming from the back of the ballroom. It was a lonely sound in the vast, quiet space, but it was clear and strong. Ilara didn't even register it at first. Her mind was still far away. But then another person joined in, and then another. The sound began to grow, slowly at first, then faster, like a handful of dry leaves being stirred by a sudden gust of wind. It was a ripple of applause that quickly turned into a wave. Slowly, as if waking from a deep sleep, Ilara lifted her head. Her vision was blurry, and she blinked a few times to clear it. And then she saw them. The entire room was on its feet. The sea of faces that had been filled with mockery and condescension just a short while ago was now a sea of admiration. People were clapping, not politely, but with a wild, unrestrained enthusiasm. Their faces were turned towards her, their expressions a mixture of awe, shock, and pure joy. The sound was no longer a ripple. It was a roar, a thunderous storm of applause that shook the very walls of the ballroom. It was so loud, so overwhelming, that it felt like it might lift the roof right off the house. A wave of confusion washed over her. They couldn't be clapping for her. It had to be a mistake. Maybe the famous pianist had come back on stage and she just hadn't noticed. She turned her head, looking left and right, but there was no one else. It was just her, in her simple gray uniform, sitting at the grand piano. The reality of the situation began to dawn on her, and it was so unbelievable, so impossible, that a small, shaky laugh escaped her lips. They were clapping for her. For the maid, from the side of the stage, she saw Mrs. Sterling frantically gesturing for her to stand up, to take a bow. Ilara's legs felt like they were made of lead. She pushed herself up from the piano bench, her body trembling so much that she was afraid she might fall. She turned to face the audience, her hands clasped in front of her, not knowing what to do. She had never taken a bow before. She gave a clumsy, awkward nod, her movements stiff and unnatural. But the crowd didn't seem to care. Their applause only grew louder. Some people were shouting, "Bravo!" and "Encore!" She saw the young footman who had revealed her secret, standing by the door with a huge, proud grin on his face. She saw the other maids and servants peeking out from the kitchen, their faces filled with disbelief and happiness, feeling a surge of something she couldn't quite name, a mix of terror and strange, thrilling joy. She managed a proper bow. It was a small, shaky thing, but it was hers. As she straightened up, the applause continued, a relentless, beautiful sound that she would remember for the rest of her life. She gave one last, overwhelmed look at the standing, cheering crowd, and then stumbled off the stage into the relative darkness of the wings. Backstage, it was a different kind of chaos. The event coordinator was crying openly. Mr. Sterling was standing with his mouth agape, staring at the stage as if he couldn't believe what had just happened in his own house. But it was Mrs. Sterling who approached her first. Her face, usually so composed and unreadable, was a mess of conflicting emotions. There was shock, gratitude, and something that looked suspiciously like guilt. She reached out and took Ilara's hands, her own hands trembling slightly. That was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard," she said, her voice thick with emotion. I don't know what to say." "Thank you." The words felt inadequate, but they were sincere. For the first time, Ilara saw her not as her employer, but as a fellow human being, moved by the power of music. Before Ilara could even think of a response, a man in a conservative dark suit approached her. He had a serious face and a notebook in his hand, and Ilara recognized him as the critic from the city's main newspaper. He had come to review the famous pianist. He looked at her, his eyes sharp and intelligent, but there was no condescension in his gaze. There was only a deep, professional respect. "Young lady," he said, his voice calm and steady, "what is your name?" "Ilara," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Ilara," he repeated, as if testing the sound of it. "I have been reviewing concerts for 30 years. I have heard all the greats. and I have never in all my life heard a performance like that. He paused, looking at her simple uniform, then back at her face. You have a gift. A raw, extraordinary gift. Have you ever had any formal training? Ilara shook her head. My mother taught me. She passed away a few years ago. The critic nodded slowly, a look of understanding on his face. She would be incredibly proud. Your technique is unorthodox, but your soul is a virtuoso. He then turned to a man who had been standing behind him, a distinguished-looking man with silver hair. This, the critic said, his voice filled with excitement, is the director of the city's Conservatory of Music? The director stepped forward, his eyes twinkling. He is not exaggerating, he said, his voice kind. My dear, what you did tonight was not just a performance. It was a revelation. We have a scholarship program for exceptional, undiscovered talent. It is a full scholarship, covering everything, tuition, room, and board. It would be an honor if you would consider accepting it. Ilara just stared at him, her mind struggling to process his words. A scholarship? To the conservatory? It was a dream she had never even allowed herself to have. It was something that happened to other people, not to her. Not to a maid. She felt tears welling up in her eyes again, but this time they were not tears of sadness or release. They were tears of pure, unadulterated hope. Later that night, long after the guests had gone and the house had fallen silent, Ilara walked out of the front door of the Sterling estate. She was still wearing her simple gray uniform, but it felt different now. It no longer felt like a costume that made her invisible. It was just something she was wearing. The cool night air felt fresh and clean on her face. She looked up at the sky, at the countless stars twinkling in the darkness. They seemed brighter than they had ever been before. She was no longer a ghost in a world of beautiful things. She was Ilara, she was a musician. And as she walked down the long, tree-lined driveway, away from the only life she had ever known, she knew that this was not an end. It was a beginning. The world was finally listening, and she was ready to play.